Right. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to contribute to today's event, and as to become kind of completely transparent, notwithstanding what it says in the programme, this is very much a co-presentation that involves just not myself, Angie Turner, who's also from the School of Geography, Geology and Environment, and Julie, who many of you will know from the School of Psychology. So, focusing on student transitions in science undergraduate education, already very interested and fascinated by some of the issues which have come up, which will be repeated from the keynote we heard earlier. So just very briefly, first of all, Julie will provide a short introduction to the nature and importance of transitions more generally. Then I'll kind of provide you with a little bit of a background to the Teaching Innovation Project. This was what we're going through is the preliminary findings related to a teaching innovation project that we completed in November last year, and there is a report associated with that I'm more than happy to share with anyone who's interested. We'll go through the key preliminary findings in terms of the key methods that are employed, before then reflecting at the end on the relevance to the healthy curricula at Keele, which form the focus of today's session. So I'll hand straight over to Julie.
Thank you, Rich. So, I've been involved in research about student transitions for quite a long time, and the reason for that was because I'd found my own transition so difficult, and then found myself working in an environment where I was supporting students. So I was a teaching fellow at Keele in psychology many, many moons ago, and was working with students who were finding university tough. And so I got really interested in this idea of, how do we adapt to university? How do students arrive and really get the most out of the learning opportunities that are available to them? How do they build their confidence and their skills? And to some extent, I adopted very much the dominant discourse within the transitions literature, which is this idea that transition is difficult. So when you look at the transitions literature, there's a lot of talk about a journey, bridging a gap, making a jump. It's difficult, it's stressful, it's challenging. And actually, that's quite a kind of difficult discourse. And it implies that students have this deficit. There's something that they don't have when they come to university that they should have. And somehow it's their job to get through this difficult time and acquire all the things that they're missing. And so my early research was kind of framed around that, I think. When I got to work for the Higher Education Academy a few years ago, I did some work with Janet de Wilder, who's now at Imperial College. And there was a real focus in our work on transitions. We talked to hundreds of students in science, technology, engineering and maths subjects, STEM subjects. We talked to sixth form teachers, sixth form students, university lecturers, exam boards, all sorts of people. And there was a lot of focus on student skills deficits, so particularly around things like critical thinking, independent study, all the things that students came from their A-levels or their Scottish Highers or whatever they'd done, got to uni and didn't know how to do. And the importance for them of learning to think like a geographer, astronomer, psychologist, biologist, substitute what you like. It was there in all of the STEM disciplines. More recently, I've been working with Naomi Winston from the University of Surrey. And what we've really started to think about is the heterogeneity of transitions experience for students. So some students transition to university and they take to it like a duck to water. And some transition to university and they feel like fish out of water. They're missing social support or they're missing something. But it's not the same for everybody. And the diversity of student voices around transition, which is what Naomi and I were looking at, is immense. And so what we really want to do is understand the individual experience of students and understand how they feel about their transition. And through the work that Naomi and I are doing, start to kind of look at student stories around transition and see how students can help each other through a process that may or may not be challenging, not have them wondering, why do I feel quite good about this when everybody else is struggling? Is there something wrong with me because I'm having a good transition? We don't want that. We want them to have a good experience, but to be supported. And so what we wanted to do with this project really was to start thinking about students at Keele and their experience of transitioning into the Faculty of Natural Sciences subjects. So understanding that transitional experience for our students and starting to be able to think about how we could support their mental health and well-being.
Cool. Right, so very kind of quickly, the focus of the project was to seek out the student voice and to get the students' own perspectives. It's interesting to hear the perspectives from a previous talk. So their perspectives and experiences of how they'd found the transition from school or college into HE had a particular focus on the schools within the Faculty of Natural Sciences, and our key interests were what were the transitions issues of most concern that were articulated by the students, and what were the, again in terms of heterogeneity, the differences in those transitions, experiences and challenges that the students experience across the different academic schools. So the methodology involved a sequential use of 3 different techniques that are used for new entrants, so level 4 or year 1 students, starting off with an online student questionnaire that was delivered within one of the taught sessions within each of the subject areas as early as possible in the semester 1 in order to get those initial experiences as they were making that transition process open to everyone to try and be as accessible and wide-ranging as possible. And then both the student focus group, which Angie will talk about in a moment, and then finally some reflective diaries at the end of the year so the students could reflect on their experiences and, for example, the kinds of interventions that they'd found of most benefit. This is going to be very much of a rattle through some of the preliminary findings. More than happy to share the report, and also for us to encourage the opportunity to have discussions with people from around the university to explore some of these kind of initial findings in a bit more detail. But starting off with the results from the questionnaire survey, we got a total of 182 responses that were, you see, the majority, about 62% male, 36% female, and then you can see the responses across 5 different kind of program areas. Natural sciences, a small number, that's a relatively new interdisciplinary program, but then you can see the response from chemical and physical sciences, maths and computing, life sciences, as well as geography, geology and the environment, and the level of the sample that represented for the entire first year cohort for each of those study areas. So I'm just going to go through some of the key findings, maybe and some of the key initial take-home messages. The first of all is that, yes, students do. There's relatively few students who don't report on finding that transition into HE challenging to some degree. So over 80% of the respondents across the natural sciences, or Faculty of Natural Sciences, found the transition to HE either challenging or somewhat challenging. This is a categorical question. They had to say either yes, somewhat, or no. So over 80%, and you can see some differences potentially already emerging between the different subject areas. So, for example, students from chemical and physical sciences, for example, there were more students within that particular area who were saying, yes, this definitely was a challenging in comparison to, say, for example, life sciences. So, not looked at the statistical significance of this at the moment, but you can already start to get that sort of sense of a different profile. But the take-home message clearly is that majority of students find it challenging to some degree. Another question, which was an open-ended question, but then the opportunity to code this and try and identify, well, what were the reasons for them finding it challenging? If you ignore this one on the right-hand side, then, the things which are often kind of quoted within the literature, and I'm sure you share in conversations, that challenge or that difficulty in terms of a different style of learning, a more independent learning style, which can be very different from what they've encountered more previously, which is more sort of strongly scaffolded or guided. Other issues that emerge, for example, related to issues related to deadlines and workload, which of course was coming up very much under the keynote we had at the start of the day. The challenge associated with the depth of the content that they're encountering in level 4 as well. And again, that sense of some differences. So, for example, students within students within chemical and physical sciences, for example, and the natural sciences were finding deadlines and workload more of an issue than students within, for example, my own School of Geography, Geology and the Environment. And again, Geography, Geology and Environment students were seemingly finding the initial content in Level 4 less of an issue than maybe students elsewhere. In terms of this whole idea of looking at sort of skills, and we got the students to sort of self-audit according to a particular series of prescribed skills areas. Again, this is a rather sort of like noisy diagram on here. But the key thing I guess we draw out of this one is that, again, there are a very different set of appraisals of their skills, competency, and areas that they should be kind of concerned across different schools. There are some areas where there's a degree of sort of consistency. Everyone is kind of consigned across the faculty in relation to issues associated with the ability to manage their time effectively. Perhaps it's hopefully not surprising that students from the School of Computing and Maths are the least concerned about their maths and statistical skills, which is reassuring. And then there's going to be obviously other issues related to, it seems that students within life sciences are particularly concerned about about class presentations. Maybe that's something which is always irrelevant. These kind of highlight some of the areas where it would be really interesting to end up having those follow-on discussions with staff members from those program areas. But clearly, very different set of responses for the students from those different subject areas. Very different awareness in terms of the central support which is available. For example, in relation to things like the right direction, which is very popular amongst students in general. So clearly, you're doing something absolutely right, probably as part of the induction process in chemical and physical sciences, with them being way above everyone else in terms of their awareness of the support which is available to them. And then just one last thing in terms of what were some of the issues that the students identified, again, within open-ended questions related to the things that have made that move to university more straightforward. Things like the productive use of online support in terms of the KLE or lecture capture. So that's obviously particularly well received within maths and computing. And then if we're looking at things like small group teaching, maybe potentially with more of that social learning component, something, for example, which is obviously working really well within things like the School of Life Sciences. Right, anyway, I'll quickly hand over to Angie, who'll say a little bit more about the focus group.
Thank you. So we wanted to take the raw data that had come through the Mentimeter questionnaires and try and rank this, find out what the priorities were. You can see from those very noisy tables, there's a lot of comments that came through. They were themed afterwards. We didn't force them into themes to start with, but we wanted to take those themes and find out within that data set what were the most important. Can we rank these things? So my background is a bit in community consultation, community planning, so I decided to steal some techniques that I've used in the past with quite maybe complicated scenarios within community planning. They're usually used for consensus building, to rank priorities, and they can assist with conflict resolution in certain situations. But in this situation, it's a really good way to be interactive with a group of students to help them to discuss and delve deeper into the data. There's a number of reasons why it's quite a useful technique to employ. It's quite semi-anonymous, so although you can really stand there and watch what somebody's doing if you want to, you lose the opportunity to make your own voice heard if you pay too much attention to somebody else. So it reduces conflict. You haven't got that direct competition with somebody. The focus is on your own action and making your own voice heard. It's very inclusive. You're not inviting a dialogue. In this case, we didn't stop people from talking. We encouraged discourse and conversation about what things meant. But you don't have to do it that way. You can ban talking if you like and just focus on the activity. So they don't have to justify what they do or why they do it. The dominant or the powerful characters that may be in the room are not given the floor to be vocal, like you might find around a board meeting or a committee meeting. It's interactive, so it's not an eye contact sport. We're not asking people to step into that assertiveness role if it's not part of their character. So whilst we've heard that assertiveness is really key, actually there are those that haven't learned that yet, and this allows them to make their voice heard. You can see the results in front of you. The whole group can see them. Reduces the argument. It's extremely simple to set up. It's very cheap to administer. And literally you need a set of concentric circles. So what did we do? The first thing was to take the raw data. So the comments that had come back from people, they were open-ended questions, and we were theming them. So we were looking at putting them into categories like independent learning, for instance. Depending on how you do this, you need to set out the room carefully. We did it so that each individual question was on a different table, and we were asking them to look at the relevant themed comments. And each table had some concentric circles. We wanted to give participants the opportunity to actually add to this data set. Although we'd spoken to 182 of these students that had taken part, had we missed something that was really quite crucial that nobody had thought about? We gave them the opportunity. This was quite rare for them actually to write anything down. And we also wanted to give participants the chance to change the themes that we'd categorised them into. Was our interpretation of what the student voice had said correct, or was there something else that we were missing? We'd got the wrong end of the stick. So then we asked each participant to choose 3 comments. So we've themed them, they're on a table, so we've got one table asking about independent learning, for instance, and all the comments that go with that. We've asked them what are the greatest challenges, and they can take 3 of the comments that are there, and we ask them to move them to the outside of this concentric circle. You can imagine if you have 10 people taking part in this, you suddenly have 30 comments if they all choose to select 3 of them. And then each participant is given 3 votes. Now they can use that on their own, they can use it spread across different options, they can vote on somebody else's. So if somebody's already taken their key comment before them and put it on the edge of the circle, doesn't mean they can't still agree with that and move it. And the idea is that as you vote for each one of those comments, it moves closer to the centre of those circles. And you can see a consensus developing, a rank developing in your comments. And this is how we used it to generate some of the information. And in terms of the key results, just 3 top headline indicators here. We asked them the question about the change from level 3 to higher education and the challenges they faced. The top one was the immediate shift from being spoon-fed to total independence. It's this expectation that they've been given set reading from A-level, whatever, and we just let them loose. We don't really give them much guidance. We asked them what the most challenging aspect of the course was likely to be. What in their imagination did they think was going to be the most difficult? And it's not surprising that exams, essays, and assignments were in there. But we also asked them one thing that had made it easier. And you'll be really glad to know that tutorials, small group work, this sense of belonging, getting to know each other, and also being part of an access course or a foundation year came out really strongly in this.
And I should highlight there's a carousel session this afternoon related specifically to this particular component of the work. So if you want to find out more about that and what that involves in practice, I'd encourage you to go along to that. So just to start to draw things to a close, the final aspect was a series of reflective diaries. Unfortunately, only 4 students ended up completing this exercise, but nonetheless, it generated some interesting comments and understandings. It was based or scaffolded around 4 different reflective points. Firstly, pre-arrival, how did students think that their university study would differ from that from school or college previously? Some issues here that emerged very much sort of chime with, again, the talk we started off with today. I thought that lecturers at university would not be there to provide individual support and guidance. This is what they were bringing with them. I believe that because of the amount of people with my discipline school, so big institutions which are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, I would merely be a number and not recognised by my lecturers. And again, for an international student, speaking as an international student is an even bigger concern. I was afraid I would have nothing to fall back on if times were rough. The second kind of theme focused on the nature and timing of any particular transitions challenge that encountered during that first year at Keele. And again, issues related to workload, related to time management. So one student from Maths and Computing saying, I've often struggled this year, especially in the first semester, with the workload, which I was not used to. It was causing a lot of stress. And, you know, some things we can recognise, it's still very much work in practice. Difficult to find the right balance between not stressing over the work and ensuring I had leisurely time to myself. And I think this is an interesting one about being absolutely clear and transparent about what's expected of students. I found it difficult to know if I was doing enough work towards each lecture. This meant that when the next lecture came around, I felt like I was behind within the whole module, creating stress. The third one was what were the useful interventions, what were the useful initiatives that we were doing already that the students found really useful. So personal tutors were really useful. I've got the 2-minute sign already, so I'm speeding up already. But also this sort of sense that we need to find ways in which we can encourage students to actually come out of their shell and participate in those kinds of events that are made available. And finally, in terms of future initiatives, again, I know that this is already in planning in Keele, the idea of more centrally adoptive initiatives to benefit future students making that transition into HE. And also in terms of social learning opportunities, which is, again, has already been mentioned. University could install an initiative early in that, but not within the first few weeks, that offers opportunities for students to meet each other and to find environments that they feel safe in. So I'll just kind of allow Julie to kind of finish things off by looking at reflecting on the ways which might be relevant to healthy curricula at Keele.
So we know from the work that we've been doing that the majority of Faculty of Natural Science students find transition challenging, or at least some aspect of it. And there's particular concerns around independent learning, increased workload and challenging content. And we know that there's variation there between the different departments, the different courses, and the specific areas of concern and how aware students are of support. We can see that there's some good practice already, so staff are seen as approachable. We're providing some online resources to support them, and we're doing some small group teaching, which is helping to build that cohesion between students and that sense of belonging. And what we'd really like to see now, I think, is to sort of build awareness of those good practices and start to build on them within the schools and programmes so that we find ways of supporting students to develop their skills, to equip them to be more confident to manage their learning and to be able to face those challenges and to ask for help. And so our plans really now are to think about disseminating these findings to schools. We'd really like to go to some school meetings or some faculty education committee meetings, things like that, to bring what we're doing and to bring what we've found, come to maybe programme committees, talk to programme directors and say, what can you do with this? Is there stuff that you can learn from this to really help reflect on what's happening in your school with your students, on these student voices, and to enhance what you're doing in terms of building student well-being through supporting this transition. And of course we would be looking for support from KIITE. We'd like to say some big thank yous. All of the students who got involved, absolutely brilliant students, and particularly those who did, you know, the time-consuming things like the diaries was absolutely amazing. The programme reps who helped us to actually access those students. Russ, who's been amazing, always. And Jane Eagles and Chris Little, who were very much a part of this project team when we started, but then had changes of role. So, hi, Chris. And so had to step out. And I personally would like to say a big thank you to Angie, who's been the person who's really kept Rich and I on track all the way through. So, thank you.